I can't understand why you're kicking up such a fuss, Laura. You should have anticipated this, Paul stated, his tone icy and uncaring as he prepared his luggage. You're hitting the big 50 today, and if we're being truthful, I just think you're too ancient for my taste these days. Those words were like getting punched in the gut, each syllable more hurtful than the one before. I remained motionless in our bedroom, the very same space where we'd spent a quarter of a century together as husband and wife, observing my husband, who is 5 years older than me, neatly folding his expensive button-downs. Paul, I'm begging you. Today is my birthday, can't we discuss this? I begged, my voice hardly audible. He simply chuckled, but it was a mean sound, completely different from the affectionate sound I'd been drawn to many years ago. There's simply nothing left to discuss. Amanda is expecting me. She's a quarter of a century old, stunning, and genuinely gets me. He closed his suitcase with a sense of purpose. I've already submitted the paperwork for our divorce. Don't pretend to be shocked. You had to have noticed how uninterested I've been recently. I'm Laura Mitchell, and this is how my 50th birthday became the day my world collapsed, or at least that's how I felt then. Working as an event coordinator in Houston, I dedicated years to ensuring other people's significant events were flawless. Yet here I was, on what should have been a major celebration for me, watching my husband leave me for a woman young enough to be my daughter. I was completely blindsided by this. Okay, so Paul had been acting kind of aloof recently, working late and getting these shady business calls, but I just figured it was work stress. We had created a pretty good life, you know? A nice house in the suburbs, vacations every so often, tons of memories we made together. I had been his rock through every job change, every difficulty, every success he had. Looking back, I guess the warning signs were there all along. I'd shelved my own ambitions more times than I can even remember, thinking we were in this together, building something that would last. The new wardrobe, suddenly needing to work out all the time, constantly talking about staying youthful. All while I was putting together our anniversary trip to Europe, a surprise I had been saving up for well over a year to afford. The messed up part is that I had just finished booking everything the night before, with no idea that my husband was planning a trip of his own that was totally different. He told me not to call or text him as he adjusted his collar in the mirror one last time. The lawyer will be in touch to figure out the divorce stuff, Paul said. And with that, he left our bedroom, carrying fancy luggage without even a hint of guilt. The man I adored, the one who vowed we'd spend our golden years together, had just thrown away a quarter-century of marriage like it was old news, and he picked my half-century birthday to do it. The initial weeks after Paul's departure were a hazy mixture of crying and restless nights. I roamed throughout our home, which was now distressingly silent, feeling like an apparition within my own existence. Each space held recollections, like the kitchen where we'd thrown so many gatherings with friends, the living area where we'd passed countless relaxed Sunday mornings, and the yard we'd envisioned and cultivated as a team. I scarcely ate anything, dropped 15 pounds, and could barely concentrate while at my job. During those early days, Sarah, my closest friend, practically began living with me. Having lost her own spouse to cancer 2 years prior, she possessed a deep understanding of sorrow. At the very least, Michael didn't intentionally leave, she would assert, her voice tense with frustration toward Paul. She spoke the truth. There was a distinct sort of suffering in being abandoned, in realizing that I wasn't adequate. The divorce process was harsh. Paul's attorney was forceful, contending that because I'd allowed myself to become unattractive and prioritized my job instead of being an ideal wife, I warranted less than what I was entitled to. It was irrelevant that I had been Paul's support system during his early professional obstacles, or that my event planning company had provided the means for us to survive during the difficult times. What really mattered was that they thought I was, as they put it, over the hill. I realized that Paul had been plotting this for a long time, carefully shifting funds around and nodding every fault he thought our marriage had. He even created a secret Instagram profile to flaunt his new life with Amanda, showing pictures of fancy dinners and lavish trips I was completely unaware of. Each new discovery felt like yet another act of disloyalty, another break in what I had believed was a strong marriage. The hardest part was dealing with our social circle. Some people quietly sided with Paul, hinting that I should have worked harder to stay young and appealing. Some just stayed away from me, as though a divorce was something they could catch. My own sister Jennifer even had the nerve to ask if I'd thought about getting Botox, just to look a little more refreshed. Only Sarah and a few real friends remained supportive, reminding me that my worth was far greater than my age or how I looked. The final straw was one wet afternoon as I was going through old photos, trying to figure out what to save. I stumbled upon our wedding album, and there we were, young and in love, full of optimism for the future. The difference between that young bride full of hope and the reality of my life now really struck me. Instead of causing me to cry again, something else happened entirely. I could feel anger building and along with it, a sense of resolve. I phoned Martha, my most accomplished client, who had been wanting me to take on a larger part in her corporate events firm. I had consistently said no in the past since I didn't want to put in extra hours that could separate me from Paul. The unfortunate twist of that choice was definitely clear to me at this point. "Martha, do you recall that job we talked about previously? Is it still open?" I inquired, and I have to say, my tone was more assertive than it had been for weeks. "Laura, definitely, yes. However, it would involve overseeing our company's growth on the West Coast. You'd be required to travel a lot, essentially starting over in creating our customer base out there." "Are you positive you're up for that?" I glanced all around my desolate home, taking in the life I had carefully constructed around a guy who had simply discarded it all. I responded, "I'm not only prepared, Martha, I require this." Later that night, while I was sitting at my kitchen table devising a strategy, my phone vibrated with a message from Paul. He had included a picture of himself and Amanda at what looked like a rooftop bar, both smiling at the camera. The message said, "Just enjoying life to the fullest." "I hope you're all right, Laura." The previous version of me would have fallen apart, spending yet another evening crying. However, there had been a definite change within me. I erased the text without replying and opened up my computer. If Paul assumed he could just cast me aside and anticipate me just fatting away, he was about to be sorely mistaken. I remained awake well past midnight, exploring exercise routines, refreshing my CV, and listing out all the ambitions I had postponed because of my marriage. Once I was finally tucked in for the night, I had developed a strategy. Even though Paul seemed to think my turning 50 was the conclusion to our relationship, I intended to use it as the start of something totally different, something he'd regret missing out on. The initial real challenge to my determination appeared 3 months after Paul moved out. I happened to be in the supermarket when I bumped into Amanda's mom, Susan, who also used to teach me yoga. She came over to me with this look of sympathy, and it really made me feel sick. "Laura, I'm so incredibly sorry about all of this," she said while placing her hand on my arm. Until everything was already out in the open, I truly had no idea Amanda was involved with a man who was married. "If it means anything, I definitely don't condone their behavior," she said. I plastered on a fake smile while holding onto my shopping cart a little more firmly. "So, how are things going for them, Susan?" The question came out sounding kind of nasty, even to my own ears. She paused for a moment, then leaned in conspiratorially. "To be completely honest, not so well. Paul has been, well, really trying to control everything. He keeps tabs on every penny Amanda spends, criticizes her choices in friends, and gets all bent out of shape whenever she even talks to other guys her age. Just last week, he apparently threw a huge tantrum because she wanted to attend some music festival instead of going to some dull business dinner. That news affected me in a way I didn't anticipate. Instead of feeling hurt, I experienced this odd feeling of being right all along. All those carefully constructed posts on social media definitely weren't showing the full picture. Seeing the look of worry spread across Susan's face, I remarked gently that it must be difficult for her to witness that situation. "It is," she replied, "but what bothers her even more is watching him spend money recklessly, almost as if it's nothing, in an attempt to maintain her extravagant habits." She listed the things he was spending on, like fancy clothes, pricey dinners, and getaways. Amanda had let me know that he'd started taking money from what he'd put away for retirement. I couldn't help but think about the sizable agreement I'd battled for during our split, which was only possible when my attorney found some of Paul's secret money. He was incredibly angry when I won in court, but I stood firm. Susan glanced at her phone and announced it was time for her to head out. Then she complimented me, saying that I was looking great. She added, whatever I was doing seemed to be making a difference. She wasn't wrong. The extra weight that had come from being stressed had disappeared, and my workout routine had resulted in more muscle. Getting enough sleep and taking care of myself had made my skin look radiant, and my way of dressing had gone from comfortable wife to a more assured businesswoman. Walking away from the store, I felt invigorated. It appeared that Paul's seemingly perfect new existence had some issues, while my life was just starting to get better. The change that I'd been experiencing continued to gather steam. I dedicated all my energy to the West Coast expansion project, often flying between Houston and Los Angeles. My job put me in situations that I hadn't encountered in a long time, and I was loving it. The feeling of being alone that I'd experienced after Paul left was gone, replaced by feelings of accomplishment. While I was wrapping up a significant business arrangement in Los Angeles one night, my phone buzzed with multiple messages from Sarah. Paul, it seemed, had appeared with Amanda at the restaurant we used to love, only to discover that I was there, hosting a corporate dinner for 20 important clients. Sarah said that he'd been completely frozen the moment he spotted me. Sarah's text said, "He couldn't stop staring at you." Amanda noticed it as well. She tried repeatedly to get him to focus on her, but he was completely captivated by you in that red dress. When you got up to speak, I was sure his jaw was going to drop to the floor. That made me grin. I had just purchased the red dress. It was a treat for successfully closing a $1 million contract. The former version of myself would have considered it too daring and too flashy. But I had moved beyond that former self. Later in the evening, Paul attempted to phone me. When I ignored the call, he sent me a text message. "You were stunning tonight. I miss our conversations. Maybe we could meet for coffee at some point?" I showed the message to Emma, my assistant, the following morning. Over many shared late nights at the office, we had become very close. "He's understanding what he gave up," she commented, shaking her head. "Textbook case of a midlife crisis backfiring." She was correct. Paul had anticipated my falling apart, becoming the sad story of an older wife who'd been replaced. But instead, I'd transformed into someone more resilient, more accomplished, and somewhat ironically, more full of life than I'd been in years. The affirmation he'd sought from a younger woman was turning out to be empty while I was really thriving. That restaurant experience seems like forever ago, but my real change came together 6 months later at a big industry party. I was getting an award for doing new things in event planning, and they were holding it at the fanciest hotel in Houston. I asked Sarah to come with me because I knew Paul would be there. His company was always a sponsor for these things. I walked up on stage wearing a dark blue dress that took a whole month's pay, but I felt like it was worth it. As I took the award and started to talk, I noticed Paul in the crowd. He was by himself. I spoke into the microphone, my voice not shaking as I told everyone that being successful isn't just about making money. It's also about discovering who you really are when things don't go as planned. It turns out that what seems like the end of the road can actually be a new start. Everyone clapped really loudly. Paul came up to me at the bar after everything was over. He seemed like he had aged, and his eyes looked tired. He just blurted out that Amanda had left him. She moved in with some guy who was her age just last week. "You know, I've been thinking a lot, Laura. I really messed things up." I took a little drink of my champagne, letting the silence hang in the air. "That must be pretty rough for you," was my eventual response, trying to keep my tone even. "I miss you," he told me, his voice breaking. "I miss the life we had." Everything with Amanda was just a big nothing, like a dream that didn't come true. "Do you think we could?" he started, but I cut him off quietly but definitely saying, "No, we can't." "It wasn't just that you abandoned me, Paul. You actually tried to make me feel small. You decided to announce that I was past my prime for you on my big 50. But take a good look. I'm thriving now more than ever, and it's all thanks to my own effort." I grabbed my trophy and my evening bag. "I hope things go well for you, Paul. I genuinely mean it. But my life is only now kicking into high gear, and you're no longer in the picture." The year after that showdown with Paul brought about changes that were beyond anything I could have foreseen. My West Coast project ended up blowing all targets out of the water, which led to Martha offering me a complete stake in the company. "You've revolutionized our business," she said when we signed the contract, "and honestly, Laura, you've also reinvented yourself." She wasn't off the mark. The woman who used to focus everything she did on what my husband wanted had evolved into someone who started each day pumped about what she could accomplish. My schedule was jam-packed with meetings at work, sure, but also with art classes, hiking with a group, and going out to eat with friends, new and old. I also got rid of our old house, too many reminders of the past, and purchased a contemporary condo with a killer view of the city. Getting it furnished turned into a form of self-care, picking out each item to showcase only what I liked. I didn't have to settle on paint colors or keep Paul's prized leather chair, which I could never stand. My apartment transformed into a mirror reflecting my fresh start, decorated with vivid hues and modern artwork. Sarah jokingly suggested I was turning into a well-known figure in our group of friends. "You're an inspiration to all the women who believe life is over after a split," she remarked one night as we enjoyed some wine. I can only imagine the looks you get from Paul's friends' wives. It's probably as if you're some mythical being who's found the secret to eternal youth. The real deal was, I truly did feel more youthful than I had in ages, but it wasn't because I was trying to measure up to women in their 20s. The reason I felt so young was that I was, at long last, living in a genuine way, without constantly stressing about whether I was too old for someone else's expectations. I gathered through some of our shared acquaintances that Paul wasn't doing so well. Before disappearing, Amanda had gotten away with quite a bit of his money, and his efforts to go out with younger women were growing more and more desperate and cringeworthy. His work buddies were beginning to keep their distance, feeling awkward about his actions at company get-togethers. According to Emma, he's now become a warning to others. She mentioned this after an industry gathering where Paul arrived with yet another date who was way too young, only to be mostly ignored by his coworkers. And here I am, the example of success that everyone aspires to be. I couldn't help but notice the humor in it all. Paul had walked away from our relationship because of my age, at least that's what he said. But look at me now, thriving and doing better than I ever have before, while it looked like he was the one going downhill, burdened by the decisions he'd made and things he wished he'd done differently. A year after that big party, I got asked to speak at a conference all about women in leadership, about how to completely change your life once you're past the big 50. The humor in it all was just too much. I was going to be the main speaker on what would have been my wedding anniversary with Paul. Up there on stage, looking at all those women in the audience, I told them what happened to me, not holding anything back and not feeling angry about it. I told them that the worst things that happen to us can end up pushing us forward, helping us become who we're meant to be. This time last year, someone who promised to be with me forever said I wasn't young enough for him. Now, I'm in charge of a business that makes millions, I go all over the world, and I feel more full of life than I ever have. The reaction I got was incredible. After I was done speaking, women were waiting in line to tell me their stories, and a lot of them were crying as they told me I'd given them the strength they needed. Some of them had been through the same thing I had, while others were in marriages that made them miserable, too afraid to start over on their own. I understood that my experience had turned into something more than just me proving someone wrong. I started a program where I could help women over 50 who wanted to get back into the workforce or start something completely new. Pretty soon, a lot of women were involved, and before long we were having meetings every month, doing workshops, and even going on trips together. Seeing these women find their value and what they could accomplish again gave me just as much satisfaction as my achievements in business. Paul got in touch one final time during this phase of my life. News of my speaking gig had reached him through our professional network, and he sent me a lengthy message. He wrote about how sorry he was, how alone he felt, and how his own self-doubt had destroyed the best thing he had. He mentioned that he was now in therapy, working to understand the problems he had surrounding getting older and wanting to feel validated. I scanned through the email a couple of times and then filed it away without writing back. There was a point when what he said would have completely changed my perspective, but I was past that. What he thought of me and his regrets didn't affect how happy I was anymore. Someone attending my most recent presentation wondered if I would ever think about going on dates again. "I'm definitely not opposed to it," was my honest answer. "What I'm not doing now is trying to find someone to make me whole. I already have an amazing and fulfilling life. If I find love again, it'll be something extra in my life, not the main focus of it. Thinking about everything I've been through, I'm astonished at how different my life is now. I can barely recognize the person I was when I turned 50, when my husband left me in such a horrible way. While I'm happy about what I've accomplished at work, it's what has happened inside me that really matters. I've come to believe that age is just a statistic. What's truly important is how energetic you are, how passionate you are, and how willing you are to live life to the fullest. Paul's desperately trying to hold on to his younger years through shallow connections and showing off his stuff, but I've discovered real life by embracing myself, flaws and all. And you know what the best thing is? I didn't have to plot revenge or anything to make Paul wish he'd made different decisions. Just living my life to the fullest, concentrating on my own development and finding my joy, did a better job of it than any calculated payback ever could have. His feeling sorry isn't the same as me winning. The real victory for me is the life I've created. The amazing group of strong women around me just keeps getting bigger. We're all working together to question those old-fashioned ideas society has about getting older and what women are worth. Now, when I glance at myself in the mirror, I'm not seeing someone who's past their prime. Instead, I see a woman who's just getting started, with the best parts of her story still ahead. I got an invitation the other day to speak at a really well-known business school, where I got to talk about how I've reinvented myself, both personally and professionally. Stepping out onto the stage, I happened to see my reflection in a window and couldn't help but smile. At 51, I've got a kind of self-assurance that no age can take away. Sarah's always kidding around, saying I ought to write a book called From Forgotten to Flourishing, about my second act in life. And who knows, maybe I will. Because really, if sharing what happened to me can give other women the strength to realize their worth more than what some shallow person thinks, it's a story worth putting out there. Looking back, the existence I lead today brims with options I couldn't have dreamed of back when I was just striving to be the ideal spouse. I can journey wherever I please, come to conclusions confidently, and keep company with individuals who value me for my authentic self, not for the favors I might provide. Not long ago, I happened to hear someone describe me as that incredible lady who truly flourished after reaching the half-century mark. That comment brought a smile to my face. The thing is, that's precisely what I did. I unfolded and blossomed. It wasn't driven by resentment, nor was it about demonstrating anything to Paul. It happened because I eventually authorized myself to evolve into the person I was destined to become. Getting older isn't a deadline. Instead, it's like getting a fresh chance to start anew, but this time with greater knowledge and resilience.